Welcome to Dateline Schools, a presentation of the St. Clair County Regional Educational Service Agency, with your host, Chris Troy.
There's all kinds of history out there, and teaching the kids history over the summer can be one of the most important things you can do. So, this week on Dateline Schools, I have a gentleman whose reputation goes beyond him as far as preservation and local history, Mr. TJ Gaffney. TJ, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me today, Chris.
TJ, you're a busy man. Anybody who follows you on social media, you've got a number of projects going, it seems.
Yeah, well, as they say, master of none kind of a thing. But, I have my hands in many pots.
Well, one of the biggest pots that you just kind of getting close to wrapping up or possibly has wrapped up is the D.B. Harrington there at the Wrigley Center. That's been quite a project, hasn't it?
Yes, it's actually a project that in its current phase has been going on for 5 years, which we're getting very close to wrapping up, and has been funded through a grant from Canadian National that is basically managed through the St. Clair County Community Foundation. So,
now, TJ, tell me a little bit about your past. How did you become kind of, I don't want to say the railroad guru around here, but you do seem to be the guy people call when they have questions about railroad.
Well, I had some very early influences, like all of us who are into history. We tend to have mentors, and in my case, one of those was my godfather, Sandy Duffy, whose family owned the Port Huron Detroit Railroad, and so that's probably one of my earliest influences. Seemingly, I was always drawn to folks that worked with the railroad and railroad history. In Boy Scouts, for instance, one of my mentors was a gentleman by the name of Orville Swick, and Orv worked for the railroad for a number of years, and so I was always listening to the stories of those guys. And ultimately that led to things like doing oral histories with several the railroaders of the area when I was in my later high school and early college years, and just kind of turning that into a passion that has kind of taken to the next level, to the fact that I myself work for the railroad now as well.
But you're not just a hobbyist, though. I mean, you went to school and studied historic transportation, I believe it was?
Yes, American transportation history. I jokingly say my professors at Clemson more or less created the major for me. I kind of followed a professor who had an influence on me by the name of H. Roger Grant, and he moved from the University of Akron to become the head of the Clemson history department, and so there was already a very renowned rail history professor there by the name of Richard Saunders, and so between the two of them, they were kind of my managers, as you can say, for my project at the time for my master's thesis.
Can you give me a little bit of the history of the D.B. Harrington locomotive?
Yeah, the D.B. Harrington's named for the man who named Port Huron, Daniel B. Harrington, who was one of the early economic drivers of our area. The folks that started the Port Huron and Northwestern Railway, which was one of the very first railroads to kind of strike its way north into the Thumb region. He was a mentor to a certain era of businessman, and so they actually named the very first locomotive that the railway got for them. And that engine was built in 1878 by the Porter Bell Company, and was kind of very quickly superseded, as you can say, as the railroad grew. It's a narrow gauge locomotive, which, when we say narrow or standard gauge is what most people know when they think of a railroad, 4 foot 8.5 inches. This one is 3 foot, so it's a much narrower, much smaller locomotive. But everything that you see in a steam locomotive is there. It's just in a smaller package.
Now, that's had a couple different lives to it, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's a well-traveled piece of machinery. A lot of it actually is fairly original material, which is somewhat remarkable given what's happened with it over time. It operated here in our area until the early 1880s, and then it went to a series of different lumbering entities that, in part of the reason that it survived and had so many lives, is it was fairly easy to move. Literally you could drag it out in a sled and literally pull the rails behind you, if you will, as you were taking the lumber out. So It was up in the Lake City, Michigan area for quite a long time, Cadillac area, and then ultimately ended up in Traverse City, where it was eventually owned by the D.H. Day family, who had their hands in a variety of different interests. They would be like the Harringtons and the McMorrins here. And ultimately, the Day family then loaned the locomotive for display to the city of Traverse City from 1933 until the mid-1960s. It was on an outdoor display. Again, it's kind of remarkable that as much of it is still there. And then it was sold to a gentleman by the name of George Roos, who became famous for making Cedar Point the roller coaster mecca that we now know. But he also wanted to include a railroad around there, and so he actually bought it to operate, quickly found out that what it was going to cost to do that, so it then went out and display at Cedar Point for a period of time, and eventually was donated to the Henry Ford, although it never actually got to Dearborn. It was at a place in Ohio for a period of time, and then in 1989 it came to the Port Huron Museum, and that was the first time I've been back in the area in several years, and it's actually the start of my first involvement with the locomotive back in 1989. So,
TJ, where did this restoration begin, and why now?
Well, it actually began, or the interest in it began several years ago back in 1989, early 1990. The locomotive was deaccessioned by the Henry Ford Museum to the Port Huron Museum, and at the time, I was all of a 14-year-old freshman at Port Huron Northern, and Steve Williams, who was the director there at the time, asked me to join several other individuals in trying to find out a way that we could, bring the locomotive back home, as it were, but also look at an eventual restoration plan. Skip ahead a few decades, and long story short, the Community Foundation took an interest in the locomotive, and one of their interns at the time decided to write a grant or make a grant application to Canadian National, who had a communities fund, and lo and behold, they were able to receive a grant for the locomotive, and that was back in 2013. Things went, continued on for a little bit, trying to figure out where the ultimate location for the locomotive would come about. And then in 2018, I was asked to oversee the restoration and the partnership between the museum and the Community Foundation. And we were granted the ability to do the restoration work at the community college. And that turned out to be an excellent arrangement. Our initial goal was to see if we could get it done in roughly about 2 years, but as we all know, COVID hit, and that made things a little bit more difficult to complete the restoration, but it did give us some time to figure the ultimate home, and as you indicated, it's going to be going to the Wrigley Center.
TJ, why the Wrigley Center?
At first glance, it may seem like an odd location for the locomotive, but it fits a lot of things that, in particular, the owner of the locomotive, the Port Huron Museum, was looking for. It's a public space. It's a new public space, obviously. It has climate control, and, it most importantly has a roof. So, the restoration work that we've put into it, which is extensive and expensive, basically is protected long term. And so it turned out to be a great partnership. The owners of the Wrigley Center, Dan Dooley and Larry Jones, were kind enough to offer space for it. For those that may or may not have come to the Wrigley Center, it has a little bit of an industrial, historical type theme to part of its interior space, and so when you go there, you'll see that it kind of fits with the space in a lot of ways, and that's in large part a testament of the vision that Larry and Dan have had for that structure.
How much was there, or how much did you guys have to replace?
I would say if you were looking for a percentage, there was probably about 75 to 80% was there. The big missing things, if you will, were things like the wooden cow catcher in the front. There were some brass items and detail items that had disappeared over the years. And one of the things we were committed to where we could was to work with our host for most of the restoration, the St. Clair County Community College, and their metal fabrication program with Joe McFelda and the welding kids, to where we could let them do that fabrication. So things like the bell, for instance, it had a couple of broken castings on it. Their students actually did some of that repair for us. So it was a great collaboration from that standpoint. But I would say a lot of the wooden parts that you see there were replaced. The walkways, we ultimately ended up replacing much of the cab. And to kind of, again, add to that all-around thing, not just of history, but also of the knowledge of our environment, most of the wooden parts in a locomotive are made from reclaimed ash trees. So kind of gives you a little bit of a nice pairing of the knowledge of some of the issues that we've dealt with the environment, but also, historically speaking, they would very often use ash or oak. So.
Now, this is a facade restoration, isn't it? Or can someone go in and stoke it up and fire it up?
Well, it's pretty much, facade or what we often say is cosmetic restoration. The big issue with trying to, quote, fire it up is the boiler condition in and of itself, which the boiler was last used as basically what we call a stationary boiler, so like a boiler in a building or a house, and that was a little tough on it. So in order to actually make it a, quote, operable engine, you would actually have to make a new boiler for it. And so, you come to the point of, okay, at what point are you literally, do you have a new engine or a replica, if you will? And so we all decided that we would try and keep as much of the original material as possible.
TJ, with the Harrington restored, do you think that this could spur on other restoration in the area by giving an example of what can be done? Kind of what's your hope for Port Huron's history and really St. Clair counties?
Well, that's obviously always a hope. I mean, for those of us that have the history bug, there was always usually an inspiration on some level, be it, the steam locomotive in Marysville Park, for instance, or something of that nature. And my hope would be, yes, that, maybe some future person who's interested in learning, the old school skills of blacksmithing or woodworking or, more hands-on skills can look at that and say, hey, that's something that I could actually do or recreate or restore myself. Because as we all know, we're living in a generation where, there's a group of people that are here now doing it. But if these things in our historical objects and pieces are to remain with us as time goes on, we have to then pass that knowledge down and educate a next generation on how to restore these things and maybe even restore them better than we did. And so the case there is hopefully we generate an interest enough that we can start a future generation of folks that are into restoration.
An expensive project, a lot needing to be done to it, yet you were able to do it. You found a great house for it. Mm-hmm. Is this kind of like a historical unicorn? I mean, these things don't really happen all the time, do they?
No, and you celebrate them when they do, because in this particular case, it is a wonderful combination of public, private, and education, all coming together in one package. And hopefully, like you say, it'll lead to some other opportunities or some other potentially what would be considered out of the box thinking that can look at some of our history and say, hey, we can look at it in a new way or a new format. And that's, I think, what hopefully this project will ultimately do. We lost very recently a benefactor in Jim Atchison, who probably was a perfect example of that. And silently, Jim was one of those folks who was often asking me about, well, how's that project coming along? And so we need folks to kind of have that type of vision and be willing to step up and yes, monetary is always a thing that we have to deal with in funding things like this, but more importantly, people who are willing to take a chance to look at things in different ways, and that's always the thing that we hope with the next generation, that they're going to look at things in ways that we never have or did not, and find new avenues to both preserve our history and help people think about it in different ways.
Well, always appreciate your time and always appreciate your efforts. For Dateline Schools, I'm Chris Troy. Dateline Schools is a presentation of St. Clair County RESA.